Yeah, I think we should not keep participants wait more. Let's start. So, very good morning to everyone, and hope you all had your morning tea or coffee and feeling energized. Welcome all of you to the fourth follow-up training for Asia Pacific Virtual Winter School. And for the first time, participants from Policy Evaluation for School also joining with us. As you all know, this training series is brought to you by Asia Pacific Evaluation Association, Evaluate Asia, Evaluate Global, and Asia Pacific Communication Hub. This will be the last session of this series. And since we have participants from both the winter school and the fall school here, we are looking forward to more interactive and knowledge sharing sessions. Before the session starts, next slide, Randika. You. So before the session starts, there are a few reminders to the audience from our production team. I guess you're already familiar with this. And please rename yourself using the given format. And please always keep your microphone and video disabled all the time to avoid any quality drops. And if you have any questions or queries, or if you have any technical concerns, please leave them in the chat bar so that our production team members will reach out to you shortly. Next slide. So I'm Hasiti Samarasinghe, co-leader for Evaluate Asia and lead of Asia Pacific Communication Hub, and I will be your moderator for this session. Next slide. So, as you all know, our past follow-up training sessions were mainly catering to enhance the capacities of YEs and strengthen their network. But as I mentioned earlier, today is a bit special as our full school participants are also joining with us. And catering the needs of both audiences, we set our objectives to enhance the knowledge and skills of our participants, especially and specifically in gender responsive evaluation. And also, we are trying to strengthen the evaluation network, both the professional and YE in Asia Pacific, and to connect YEs with more experienced evaluators throughout the session. So with that, next slide. Yeah. And with that, I would like to invite Tashi Denda to give the opening remarks and welcome everyone. Tashi is a co-leader of Evaluate Bhutan, and I think he's the best person to open the floor as he's an alumnus of both the Winter School and Policy Evaluation Full School. Tashi, over to you.
Thank you, Hasiti, for this wonderful introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the fourth follow-up training for Asia Pacific Winter School. This time, we not only have participants who attended the Winter School, but also the participants from Policy Evaluation Full School, as mentioned by Hasiti. I have been fortunate enough to attend both these schools, which has taught me many things. Amongst all, gender responsive evaluation has become very important in this day and age, where we increasingly focus on inclusivity and wholesome evaluation. For this follow-up training, we are very grateful to APIA and our partners for bringing in Ms. Gabriela, who will be taking us through gender responsive evaluation. So we look forward to a very fruitful session with Gabriela. Thank you. Over to you, Hasli.
Thank you, Tashi, for that short and sweet welcome. And moving on to our main presentation, as you all know, gender responsive evaluation is more important than ever as a means for building strong systems, for generating and using evidence to improve the work we do to achieve gender equality and empowerment. And a gender responsive evaluation is a powerful tool. Sorry for that technical, right? Okay, I guess now you can see me. So what I was mentioning is gender responsive evaluation is a powerful tool for achieving the transformative agenda laid out in the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have our resource person, Gabriela Rentario, joining us today to give you a taste off on this interesting concept. And of course, I don't have to give you a long introduction to our dear Evaluate co-chair, as you already met her in previous training sessions. Gabby, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hasiti, and thanks everyone for being here today. Sorry, my voice today is not the best, but I'll try my best. So our topic today is gender responsive evaluation. And first, I will just like to give myself a brief introduction. I'm a young and emerging evaluator from Mexico, and I like to advocate for the inclusion of youth in all stages of evaluation. And why I wanted to mention this is because, like, as young and emerging evaluator, I keep learning. And like my main interest is evaluation of the SDGs, gender and complexity. And today we're going to focus on a little bit on gender. And I'm gonna explain what I've learned through like some of the time I've been working as an evaluator and learning evaluation. So to set up the context, sorry, Hasiti has already mentioned the importance of gender responsive evaluation and how the power of transformation makes it like a very important tool for all of us as evaluators, especially for young and emerging evaluators, that this approach basically could give us a lot of tools and like to face the challenges or to face in a different way the evaluations we carried on. But where are we based in the context? First, there are like some conventions and some platforms where basically the outline of gender was mentioned. First, I would like to mention the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women adopted in 1979. And this, like some years back, I was not born yet, and I'm sure like a lot of you were not born at that time. It was adopted in 1979 and is often described as the international bill for the rights of women. So this is like basically every time we see topics on evaluation and gender response, one convention to look at. Then we have the 1994 Beijing Platform for Action, which flagged 12 key areas where urgent action was needed to ensure greater equality and opportunities for women and men, girls and boys. It is also mentioned as like, it also mentioned some concrete ways for countries to bring about change. And finally, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, where we have some indicators and some in a specific SDG on gender equality. Basically, this is just like a brief context on legally where does gender responsive evaluation stand. But what is gender responsive evaluation? UN Women define it as a systematic and impartial assessment that provides credible and reliable evidence based about the extent to which an intervention has resulted in progress towards intended or unintended results regarding gender equality and empowerment of women. If we actually take a look at this definition, it's very similar to what an evaluation is, but it basically has two key components: the point of like the intended and unintended results on gender equality and empowerment of women. Gender responsive evaluation can enhance gender equality and empowerment of women by how? By incorporating gender and women's rights dimensions into evaluation approaches, methods, processes, and use. Basically, it's just basically it's just considering these gender and women rights I mentioned into evaluation in all stages of evaluation. But now, what's gender responsive evaluation? A little bit deeper. Basically, gender responsive evaluation looks at what evaluation examines and how is the evaluation undertaken. And this could give us a very good understanding of what a gender responsive evaluation is. Also, this is a quote by UN Women, and it's the degree to which, like, the first color is basically what the evaluation examines. The evaluation assesses the degree to which gender empowered relationships, including structural and other causes, give rise to inequities, discrimination, and unfair power relations. Change as a result of an intervention, and how it is the evaluation undertaking uses a process that is inclusive, participatory, and respectful of all the stakeholders. And here we do not refer to the beneficiaries as beneficiary, like to this group of stakeholders as beneficiaries, but rather to the right holders and to those duty bearers, because it's like a different approach. We're not looking at people as the beneficiaries of some program. That's why evaluation is not really undertaken using this lens. Gender responsive evaluation, as we saw it before, basically looked there. Here we can outline two key dimensions or two key things that gender responsive evaluation is looking at. The first is the results. And here we look at the extent to which a program or a project achieves the gender equality and human rights results. If we see here, this dimension of results, it includes two key components that we saw here. First is the human rights and gender equality, but also the other dimension of gender responsive evaluation is the processes. In this, we analyze the gender equality and human rights that is being mainstreamed in the programming and in the entire evaluation process. Now, I really hope that we see here that basically it's just about to bring a different lens to the evaluation and to include human rights, gender equality, and we actually examine this along the whole project. Then a good question I asked myself is when to use this gender responsive evaluation. And I found in the literature when to use it when evaluating any project or program with an explicit focus on women's rights and women's empowerment, or which particular or a program or a project that actually particularly targets women. But there are also other programs and projects that do not target women. However, the unintended results affect women. And then we could also use this kind of approach. Basically, when to use it, it's in any project that seeks to contribute to social impact, or as Cecilia mentioned, it's like basically any project that seeks to contribute to this transformation and change with a different perspective, with a using and integrating the gender lens and the human rights lens. But now, to use it or not to use it, that's the real question, because sometimes people, and I've seen it like in some times, that people just eager to use this approach, but not really framing it during the project or during the program. So we really need to be really careful about when to use it and how to use it, because sometimes we are trying to seek like a contribution of a project or a program that do not have any impact or do not have any focus on a gender perspective. And then we just need to be really careful on the unintended results of that program or project to see actually if we could use this approach. And sometimes I get asked, what's the methodology to use? Actually, gender responsive evaluation is not really a methodology, but an approach that can be applied in any other kind of evaluation. I don't know if you're familiar with, like, for example, design evaluations or processes or results. And this, I actually like to see it like this lens, this gender responsive evaluation approach can be applied in any other kind of evaluation. And that's why sometimes it gets a little bit tricky because it's not like a straightforward methodology, or that you can define like step 1, 2, and 3, but rather to be adaptive. And one thing I think it's really important in using gender responsive evaluation is the capacity and the ability to just look at the program or a project critically, having this gender lens. But then if it's not a methodology, how can I use this approach? Actually, I'm sorry to mention this, but like as I just said, there is no like really a straightforward process on how to use it. Rather, there are different approaches, and sometimes like there are like these 3 concepts that are normally used during the gender responsive evaluation. It doesn't like in different like approach, like this approach, but within different contexts. And these are the 3 elements or 3 dimensions. First is the inclusion, and this is about making sure that different peoples contribute and actually benefit from this gender-based evaluation. This basically means disaggregating stakeholders into different groups, depending on their status, on their gender, or like different characteristics. This approach or this dimension of inclusion basically aims to make sure that specific group of women or girls are not excluded from the process. And why are we saying this? Because there is like no women and girls, it's not like a whole mass, and like women and girls are all the same, as sometimes we hear. It's not like including one woman, you include all of them, but rather this inclusion dimension aims to make sure that specific groups of these women or girls are not excluded from the process, but rather included. For example, sometimes in my experience, some evaluations, it's easier just to look for women who have some degree of power in a community or a group, and it's rather more difficult to reach women that are not in power within an organization or a community. But really using this gender responsive approach means to include all of them, considering their differences. An inclusive evaluation will actively seek and ensure not to avoid or not to ignore different groups of women and like or girls or etc. It's rather to include as many voices and listen to many voices that have a stake on the program or project. The second dimension is participation, and this basically means that we need to ensure that different stakeholders are consulted about the evaluation along the process and actually participate in the decisions about the evaluation process, what it will be evaluated and how it will be evaluated. If you remember before, I mentioned that evaluation evaluation basically tried to incorporate the participation. It's a process that is inclusive, participatory, and respectful of all stakeholders. And that's why like this participation concept or this participation dimension is really, really important, because it also means to assess how different groups or how different stakeholders have been able to participate not only in the evaluation, but also in the design and implementation of each of the projects or programs. And last, the equal power relationships. I mentioned that, and this basically involves addressing power relations between or within different groups. And this is also a key component, because this means that us as evaluator actually need to acquire a full, like a deeper understanding on the context in which the program or the project is taking place, of the changes that have been taking place. But also this equal power relation dimension means that evaluation needs to be conducted in a way that is sensitive to the different degrees of empowerment of each of the disadvantaged groups. And that's why I wanted to have like the 3 dimensions here are different, but somehow are related, because it's about listening to different groups, understanding their differences, and understanding how they connect and how they relate to each other, and how we need to be sure and we need to ensure to listen all of those voices. And sorry, here we have like these are like the three key dimensions, but we also have good practices. What a good gender responsive evaluation look like? What should we include? Basically, this is also from an UN Women document that actually it's really helpful. I've been using it. And it mentions 3 good practices. First is to include the gender equality and human rights criteria and mainstream it as a OECD DAC criteria, rather to look at it as a criteria that will follow all the intervention. Then the second good practice is that theory-based approaches are using the gender responsive evaluation is being used with theory-based approaches with the use of specific analytical frameworks. And the last one, and this actually, I really like it a lot, because it says that gender responsive evaluation, a good practice within it is to actually think in a system and complexity approach when including responsive designs. And what do I mean by this? And if there are some instruments on this, on the first good practice, gender equality and human rights criteria, and how to mainstream it into as a criteria, this good practice basically aims to be transformative, again, participatory, and again, culturally sensitive. In this good practice, it's about fostering an inclusion of and participation of different stakeholders, but specifically on those that are at higher risk of having their rights violated. And this is just kind of to understand the context and the circumstances of each of these groups. And then to address the power dynamics and see what are the causes of exclusion, discrimination, and equity, so we can include this perspective into our evaluation. This is the first good practice. It's just like looking at an intervention and an evaluation with a different lens. The second one, and I'm not that familiar with this one, is this good practice about theory-based approaches with the use of analytical frameworks. And basically in this one, the author has mentioned that we need to think and combine different gender analytical frameworks. And I can send over to you like different analytical frameworks and how to use them together with this gender approach. And finally, the last good practice, and the one I mentioned, is about systems thinking and complexity. This basically invite us to look at the programs and projects, not just like as a separate entity, but rather as a part of a system, as a part of the complex context. UN Women developed something that is inclusive systematic evaluation for gender equality, environment, and marginalized voices. And why I really like this good practice is because not only it's innovative, not only consider the SDGs, that is really important, but also looks at the programs and project with like 3 cross-cutting dimensions. The first one is about gender equality, that is also part of an SDG. Marginalized voices, that it actually relates to participation and inclusion, the dimensions of gender responsive evaluation, but also, and that sometimes is not really looked at, is that include the environment and how these 3 dimensions actually bring art together and how we are looking at them together and how their interconnections actually work rather to think about this dimension as separate issues. And I really like this. If you have the chance to look at the inclusive systemic evaluation for gender equality environments and marginalized voices, I would recommend it, because this is a very good tool actually to see how it is applied, but also to get some idea of like particular questions that are being asked when using a gender responsive evaluation approach, how to actually include it. It's not about, I don't know, like having data collected or data monitored, separated by gender or by sex, but rather how to ask good questions on this sense. And here, just as a summary of UNEC, is what are the minimum requirements of a gender responsive evaluation? And this guidelines is just the gender responsive evaluation should include at least one explicit evaluation question in relation to gender equality, to report against gender disaggregated indicators. And that's really important to have this data disaggregated by gender, but it's not the only thing. It has to be combined with several of other questions. A gender responsive evaluation should be based on gender responsive stakeholder analysis, including human rights roles. And here is just thinking and including women, not like different perspectives of different women in power, not in power, those who have more in the possibility to be human rights violated, etc. And another requirement is to include consultation with right holders, include gender analysis in any description of the context, include an analysis of the extent to which internationally and nationally agreed norms on gender equality are met by an intervention, include discussion on gender equality through any section dealing with findings, and have at least one conclusion and recommendation that explicitly addresses gender equality. If you see, actually all of these requirements are kind of summarized with this: inclusion, participation, and equal power relationships. We're actually having requirements in all of these three dimensions, including different rights stakeholders, including human rights roles, and the power relationships and the participation of different groups or subgroups. That's why I really like this, because if you can take something as a gender responsive evaluation, should include this or should consider this. It's about inclusion, participation, and equal power relationships, and we need to be really mindful and careful about them. And just because I wanted kind of to be practical, is that also UN Women developed the rapid assessment tool to evaluate gender equality and women empowerment results. And this tool basically looks at three different dimensions. The first is leadership and participation, the second is protection and safety, and the third is economic well-being. In all of these three dimensions, UN Women developed a questionnaire, and it also includes one on the program background. And this questionnaire asks the kind of questions as: do the program documents explicitly refer to a formalized gender analysis? Do the program actually use age disaggregated data, gender disaggregated data? How often the program is being monitored? Are women or girls consulted on regular basis? Have women and girls been consulted at the design phases? Do this group of people, of women and girls, actually feel safe during the monitoring exercises? And there are like a lot of questions that are related to these three dimensions. Also on safety, how many people have access to crisis-affected household personal data? On economic well-being, how satisfied are women with the livelihood related to different components? And this tool can be implemented to different interventions and actually to see what's the level of empowerment. And why I mention this is because they actually proposed the gender results effectiveness scale, which actually one of the results is that an intervention can be either gender negative, gender blind, gender sensitive, gender responsive, gender transformative. And in the context we are living, where we actually want that the intervention have this transformative power and the devolutions have this transformative power, and we are seeking actually gender equality, or goal or attempt will be that most interventions will be gender transformative or gender responsive. And why? Gender transformative attempts to redefine women's and men's gender roles and relations to actually create and achieve greater equality. The interventions that are being labeled as gender transformative are interventions that actually seek to target structural causes that cause gender inequality, which also has like a long-lasting impact on power and choices and control. And gender responsive, basically it's an intervention or program or policy that is formulated in ways that actually taking into account gender inequalities or inequities. If we think in the design of a program, is that this program or project actually consider these inequalities and do something about it, and respond proactively to overcome and eliminate such inequalities. Why? In order to also achieve greater equality and, again, women's rights and women empowerment. The other three results or scales is the gender sensitive. Gender sensitive level recognize gender differences and makes an attempt to redress these existing gender inequalities. Gender blind programs or projects actually fail to take into account the different socially constructed roles of women, boys, girls, and actually fail to address each of these groups' needs. These kind of programs basically maintain the status quo and will not help to transform and to achieve gender inequality. And the kind of programs that are gender negative, that are those who actually have a negative outcome that reinforce existing gender inequalities and norms. And I really like this scale because it actually gives us in just one blink what are kind of the different types of programs, or what's the level they include the gender. And here I would like to ask you an example. There's this policy that actually includes several programs and projects seeking to achieve gender equality. I know there are like 100 or 200. It's a strategy delivered by some government. And when you're trying to analyze whether this strategy or this policy has any degree of gender lens, you find that all the programs and projects are actually targeted to the entire population. And when you look deeper, why? The people from that leads the implementation of each of the programs or the design tells you we target the entire population because we do not discriminate anyone. And here, this is a real example. I'm not gonna tell you from where or when or etc., but this is actually something that I've encountered in my work. I was doing an evaluation of a policy that was seeking to achieve gender equality, and when we looked at the programs, we found, okay, yes, in theory, like some of these projects would be good to achieve great equality, but when we asked the people, but why it's not specifically targeted to one group, or why it doesn't address gender equality, they told us, oh, because we target the entire population. we do not discriminate on the access to these kind of programs or projects. In this case, in which of these scale levels do you think this kind of policy is? Yes, Tamang, it's gender blind because it actually has no intention to, it actually fails to take into account the different socially constructed norms, and they basically trying to maintain the status quo. And this kind of interventions or policies will not really help to transform the unequal structure of gender relations. And I don't know, but like a lot of people actually, when thinking about gender, I've seen and I've faced that a lot of people just like, oh, we do have some programs that seek or that aim to look for gender intervention, for gender transformation, but we don't want to only target it to women because that will lead to discrimination. And it's something that might be basic for some, but really in the real life, it's a different mindset to be considered. And I had some other examples here, but I cannot find them. Let's see if they come later. So here, there was this summary of common findings on gender responsive evaluation, what actually worked to achieve greater equality and what didn't work to achieve the equality, gender equality. What worked was basically addressing this intersectionality within the evaluation process, to have this gender perspective along the process, to address gender equality challenges and the combination of cross-sectoral interventions. And that's why I think a systems approach and more complexity approach is better, because you actually look at the intersectionality, to the combination of different interventions, to a multi-stakeholder coordination mechanism, and you see at the entire context. What didn't work is to have, in order to achieve gender equality, was to have fragmented intervention, to have resource being allocated inequitably. So just to have, I don't know, like 100 interventions that all of them did the same or didn't do the same, but they were not really coordinated. They were like isolated. And also weak institutional mechanisms where people or where programs were not actively seeking for gender equality, that they were not really enforced to look at programs with a gender lens, or that they didn't have the mechanisms to collect data disaggregated. And this is what, like, to mention some of the common findings. And I think I'm just on time for if you have any questions, or yeah, if you have any questions about this, if I could be, I see there's one question. How to promote gender responsive evaluation when the client or program is not yet in the responsive scale? Well, we see or understand that the program and intended target and direct impact is to women, or how to convincing them gender lens is necessary? That's a very good question, Monica, and that's a very difficult one. But what I've seen, like, for example, is just that has worked in my case, but like anyone else can just drop a message on the chat box that has worked for all of them, is to show, like, first it's just like this, how can I say this? Kind of to bring the topic, just like very start with being sensitive, like to to make some campaigns or some courses or training, why it's good to include this perspective, or sort of what we're doing here, and what benefits could bring to the entire intervention. For example, when limited resources, how can we move the indicators upwards? And still this being sensitive to the changes, and like to really bring the topic slowly, so people think and understand why it's important, and yet it's difficult. And then, like, for example, in a program or project I was working on, they were like, no, we don't want to discriminate, so we should just include everyone. And we started doing just like this, being sensitive to, okay, it's important, yes, we will include everyone, but why it's important to particularly focus on this particular group. We didn't mention, oh, we need to be gender sensitive at the beginning, but we kind of just introduced the concept, and the client was not really excited about it, but slowly it kind of got into their perspective that it would be good to include this this perspective, and why it was good. But I don't know if anyone else has any good example on that one. I actually been like only in a couple of projects that people, or the responsible people, was not really fond of and include a gender responsive evaluation. But what we did first, it was just providing them with information, why it could be important, or why it could be, relevant, and maybe bringing some success stories, some good practices, and why to do it, and how to do it. And sometimes people just scared, because when you tell them gender responsive evaluation, it's just like, okay, now it comes with, I don't know, like with some sort of inclusion of different groups that normally they will not think about it. But if you start slowly developing, introducing the concepts, not rather the title, sometimes has worked in my case. I don't know, anyone has any question or comments to that question? That's a good one, Monica, actually.
Gabby, shall I share my slides?
Yeah, I also want to say thank you.
Yeah, so okay, hope you all can see my screen. Great. So thank you, Gabby, for that wonderful presentation. And yeah, now it's time for questions. If our participants have any questions or comments, you can drop it in the chat bar, or if you want to present it yourself, please raise your hand so that you can unmute yourself and ask from Gabby. Any questions? I personally have 2 questions, but before that, let's see whether our participants have any questions. Okay. Maybe. Gabby, shall I ask you? I do have a first questions. So you mentioned when to use gender responsive evaluations, right? Can I know, is there any instances when not to use this gender responsive evaluation?
That's a good question, Hiziti, because the literature actually, what I've seen is a little bit mixed. Some of the literature actually mentions that in some infrastructure projects, or some programs or projects that are on that scale of infrastructure, and that is not really targeted to any, that is more universal, or that it has an effect or an impact on a larger group. But yeah, like literature, like most of it says that infrastructure projects, or this kind of.
Thank you. And can you share some more practical examples or your experience using a gender lens on evaluation?
Sure. What I mentioned, I really like the inclusive systematic evaluation for gender equality and environmental marginalized voice, is because we use that approach and that kind of questions into an evaluation on a specific program here in Mexico, where we basically took the systems approach and how the connection between gender equality, marginalized voice, and environment, and how they could connect to each other, considering a systems approach. It was good in our case, and because we actually used some of the questions that were developed by UN Women, but also we adapted some of the questions to our context and to our context. And another one, actually, it was the example I mentioned. I was doing an evaluation of a set of different programs and projects that were grouped so they could pool all the resources and all the financial resources to achieve gender equality, or that was the claim. But then when we started looking at the different, first we included like a group of different stakeholders into our analysis. We understood the context on what it was being developed and why these particular programs or projects have been included into this big policy. And then kind of try to understand the different situations of different groups of women and men that were like in different levels of equality and access to opportunities. And so we basically did that just to understand the context. And then when we started the evaluation, just what has worked and what didn't work, we realized that the indicators or these monitoring indicators were not being, they didn't have any effect. And we started looking at the projects and the design, and all of the programs and projects were either targeted to the entire population or not even targeted to the entire population, but they claimed, oh, this is an infrastructure program, for example, but it does have an impact on the entire population, and women is included in the entire population. And that was the answer of one of the, like, of a lot of the people who were implementing these kind of programs. And when, like, we actually realized that they have a whole strategy for gender equity was gender blind, that it was just by the name that was looking at gender equity, but rather was not considering gender anywhere, because they claimed they didn't want to discriminate anyone.
Well, I must say that was a very enriching session, and since we have only a few minutes left, I would like to the next session. And Gabby, thank you very much for sharing all this knowledge and supporting us continuously. As a YE, personally, I learned a lot today. And okay, does anyone have any questions? I kindly request all our participants to stay muted. Thank you. And now we have come towards the end of this session. And as this is our last session of this year in this series, we would like to take a memory back home. We are kindly requesting all of participants to open their cameras to take a group picture. And production team, please let us know, please give us a signal when you're done. and I kindly request all our participants to switch on their cameras and join with us. Are we production team?
Thank you, everyone. So, Hasati, you can go ahead.
Great, thank you, Madhuka. So, thank you, everyone. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Asela Kalugampitiya to give the closing remarks. Dr. Asela is the president of Asia Pacific Evaluation Association and Sri Lanka Evaluation Association. Asela, over to you.
Thank you, Hasiti. Thank you very much for the participants and our speakers as well. This is to actually thank you not only for this session, but also for the series. We had 4, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay, because I hear background noise.
Yeah,
That's why.
better.
Okay, so we had 4 sessions because now when we were having the winter school last year, we promised to the winter school participants that we are going to have some follow-up sessions to increase their knowledge further than the sessions we conducted for the winter school. And also we had a fall school for policymakers, winter school for young and emerging evaluators, and the policy school for policymakers. And both we promised that we will have additional knowledge events. So this is something we offered. Of course, Gabriela Renteria, Chair of Evaluate Global, conducted all sessions from May. We had the first session in May, and then August, second session, and September, third session, and this is the last session for this year. Of course, Gabriela covered journeys of evaluators and tips for YEs, and also logical framework as a tool for M&E, 2030 agenda and M&E tools, as well as this one about gender response evaluation. So we must really thank Gabriela for doing these sessions. And Amanda moderated first 3 sessions. We must thank Amanda also. She is the project officer at SDF Global Australia, and also YE, one of the leaders of Young and Emerging Evaluators and Evaluate. So we must thank her also for moderating this series, as well as Asiti for moderating this session. And all our participants participating in all the sessions, follow-up sessions, and getting further knowledge on monitoring and evaluation and the field. And our wonderful team, producers, organizers, APIA Secretariat team, Randika and Madhuka, and also the communication team disseminating all these messages. So we have big volunteer force behind all our events. We must thank them as well. This is a joint effort, all these follow-up events by Asia Pacific Evaluation Association, Evaluate Asia, Evaluate Global, Evaluate Action Campaign, and also Asia Pacific Communication Hub. So we note all these collaborations and partnerships, and we believe in these partnerships. With that note, let me also say that we are going to have the next winter school in December, 8 to 10 December this year, and we will conduct follow-up training for them in 2023. You, as alumni of winter school as well as fall school, also can join these follow-up events in next year as well. Thank you, everyone, and all the best for the year 2023 as well.
Thank you, Dr. Asela. We really appreciate your presence today. I know that you are a very busy person. And before leaving, there are a few reminders to our participants from APIA team. And my screen is changing. I'm having a bit of a technical difficulty here. Okay, cool. So there's a few reminders to our participants. APPIA and its partners are getting ready to celebrate their achievements in 2022 and preparing for 2023. So it's celebration times, guys. And EVA Vision 2022 is on its way with many interesting events, as you can see. Especially, we would like to invite you to the Asia Pacific Regional Strategy, Asia Pacific Regional Dialogue on National Evaluation Policies and Systems on 5th December. And next day, on 6th of December, is the day for our WISE. Evaluate Asia is celebrating its 3rd anniversary and inviting WISE around the region to share their ideas. So our production team will be putting the registration links in the chat. You can get registered, and we are looking forward to meeting you all. And before saying goodbye, I would like to invite you to engage with our partners. You can post, comment, or share your thoughts and what you have learned by tagging us on social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And of course, do not forget to follow us so that you won't miss any amazing opportunities coming up. Also, you can email to us if you have any feedbacks or concerns using the email addresses mentioned here. And thanks again, everyone, for joining with us today. And we have tons of programs coming up next year as well. So keep in touch and stay safe. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Bye.
Thank you, Gabby.